What would you do if the one you prayed to for help never answered, and in a moment of pain you lashed out and destroyed her image? A soldier tore down a statue of the Virgin Mary, shattering the cold marble into 100 pieces on the ground. The sound of it was a final, brittle crack in the silence of a Tuesday night, a sound that echoed the breaking inside his own chest. Dust, smelling of limestone and old prayers, filled the air and coated the back of his throat. He left the pieces scattered under a single flickering street lamp, a testament to a faith that had failed him. Sergeant Leo Martinez was a man made of straight lines and hard angles. His uniform was creased to a razor's edge, his boots held a black, depthless shine, and the bunk in his barracks at Fort Drum, New York, was a perfect rectangle of taut green wool. The world outside his window was a wash of November gray, the sky a flat, unforgiving lid over the sprawling base. Jefferson County was preparing for a winter that promised to be long and severe, and the cold had already settled deep into the bones of the land. It was a cold Leo understood. It lived in him, too. His days were a metronome of discipline without purpose. Morning formation, physical training, weapons maintenance, drills that felt more like muscle memory than preparation. He moved through the routines with an efficiency that his superiors praised and his peers respected, but it was the efficiency of a machine. His gaze was distant, fixed on some point beyond the horizon, beyond the leafless trees that clawed at the New York sky. The air in his shared room was sterile, smelling only of floor wax and laundry detergent, a space wiped clean of any personal history. He would sit on the edge of his perfectly made bed, tracing the seams of his combat trousers, feeling the rough texture of the fabric. The room was a cell of his own making, a place where order was meant to keep the chaos at bay. But the chaos was not outside. It was behind his eyes, in the silence that followed every shouted command, in the hollow space that had opened up inside him a year ago. He was a soldier with no war to fight, except for the one raging within the rigid confines of his own skin. That war had begun under the fluorescent hum of hospital lights. He remembered the smell of antiseptic at Samaritan Medical Center in Watertown, the squeak of a gurney's wheels on the polished linoleum floor. He remembered the doctor's mouth forming words that made no sound, a silent film of a life ending before it had even begun. Maria, his Maria. Her name was a shard of glass in his throat. They had been driving back from a weekend trip, talking about names for the baby, the car filled with her laughter. He'd woken up in a hospital bed, a single cut over his eye, while she was gone. The state trooper had explained it at his bedside, a slick of rain on his hat, his voice low and practiced. A patch of black ice on Route 11, a spin, another car. It was nobody's fault, he'd said. Just a thing that happened. But Leo had placed the fault squarely on the silence from above. He had prayed every day of her pregnancy, prayed for a healthy baby, a safe delivery. He had held the rosary his abuela had given him, the one Maria loved to tease him about, and he had begged. After the funeral at St. Patrick's, the same church whose garden he would later violate, he had gone home to an apartment that was no longer his. The newly painted nursery was a pale, hopeful blue. A half-assembled crib stood in the corner, its wooden slats like the ribs of a skeleton. He remembered standing in the doorway, the instruction manual in his hand, and feeling an absence so total it was a physical weight, pressing the air from his lungs. He took the small gold cross from the wall above where the crib would have been, and he had bent it in his fist until it snapped. That Tuesday, he found himself walking the quiet streets of Watertown, the base feeling too small to contain the pressure in his skull. At 11:17 p.m., he stood before the grotto at St. Patrick's Church on Massey Street. The life-sized statue of the Virgin Mary stood in the alcove, her hands open in a gesture of welcome. It was the same gesture he had seen 1,000 times in his grandmother's house, the same one he had prayed to for Maria's safety. The sight of it was a lit fuse. He saw not grace, but a lie carved in cold Carrara marble. He didn't know where the hammer came from. He only knew its weight felt right in his hand, a solid and undeniable truth. The first strike against the pedestal sent a spiderweb of cracks through the stone. The sound was sharp, an affront to the sleeping neighborhood. He swung again, this time at the outstretched hands, and the marble fingers shattered, falling like pale petals onto the dark grass. He didn't stop. He struck the face, the folded robes, the serene curve of the neck, until the figure was a ruin. A car driving down Massey Street slowed, its headlights washing over the scene for a moment before it sped away. From the sidewalk across the street, an elderly woman walking a small dog stopped dead. She let out a small, sharp gasp, and a jangle of keys slipped from her trembling hand, clattering on the pavement. Leo didn't look at them. He only saw the broken form at his feet, its open hands now broken at the wrist, its placid face now a jagged landscape of shadow and fracture. The rage subsided, leaving nothing but the cold and the ringing in his ears. He dropped the hammer and walked away into the darkness. By sunrise, a small crowd had gathered. Yellow police tape cordoned off the grotto. 2 Watertown police officers took notes while a parish priest stood with his hands clasped, his face a mask of quiet sorrow. People spoke in whispers, their breath pluming in the cold morning air. Words like desecration and sacrilege drifted over the scene. Someone had already placed a small bouquet of grocery store carnations at the edge of the police tape, a small, defiant act of reverence. Leo sat in a booth at the Crystal Restaurant on Public Square, a few blocks away. He stared into a mug of black coffee, its surface a dark, unreflecting pool. The murmur of conversation from the surrounding tables was a low hum of shock and sadness. He heard a waitress telling a customer what had happened at St. Patrick's, her voice laced with disbelief. Leo kept his eyes down, the warmth of the mug doing nothing to touch the chill inside him. The coffee tasted like ash. He left the diner and walked, not back to the base, but through the city's old neighborhoods, the bare branches of the maples stark against the gray sky. When he passed the church again in the afternoon, the police were gone. A small group of parishioners was there, kneeling on the cold ground outside the tape, praying the rosary. A makeshift collection of candles had appeared, their small flames flickering bravely in the breeze. He saw the old woman from the night before, the one with the dog. She looked up and her eyes met his for a fraction of a second. There was no recognition, only a deep, shared sadness that he felt he had no right to. Back in the barracks at Fort Drum, the rigid order of his room felt like a cage. He tried to clean his rifle, but a tremor had started in his right hand, a persistent, unnerving vibration that made the simple act of reassembling the bolt carrier group impossible. He dropped a pin, and it rolled under his bunk with a tinny sound that echoed the falling of the house keys on the pavement. He left it there. A band of pressure was tightening around his chest, making each breath a conscious effort. He stripped his bunk and remade it 3 times, pulling the wool blanket so taut it could have been a drum. But the feeling of disquiet wouldn't leave. His roommate, a young private first class named Evans, came in and tried to make small talk about a weekend pass. Leo answered in monosyllables, his gaze fixed on the wall until the younger man retreated to his own side of the room with a shrug. The silence that fell between them was heavy and absolute. Sleep did not come. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling. The image of the shattered face of the statue burned onto the back of his eyelids. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the jagged marble, the empty space where a gentle expression had been. At 1:45 a.m., the building was completely still, the only sound the low mechanical hum of the heating unit. He felt a profound isolation, as if he were the only person awake in the entire world, a world he had just made uglier. The tremor in his hand was worse now, a visible shaking he couldn't control. The hum of the heater stopped. A silence descended on the room, so deep and complete that it felt like a pressure against his eardrums. The air, which had been stuffy and warm, grew suddenly, sharply cold. The kind of cold that feels like it's coming from inside the walls. A soft, blue-white light began to emanate from the far corner of the room, near the lockers. It was not electric. It was gentle and alive, pulsing softly like a captured moonbeam. Leo sat up, the blanket falling away from his chest. Then came the scent, It was the unmistakable fragrance of roses, not a cloying perfume, but the living, dewy smell of 1,000 fresh-cut blossoms. It filled the small room, displacing the sterile scent of wax and detergent, and for a moment, Leo thought of his mother's garden. Within the soft luminescence, a figure began to resolve. It was a woman, robed in blue and white, her form composed of the light itself. She was silent, her expression one of immense, heartbreaking sorrow, but a sorrow without anger, without judgment. Her hands were held open, just as the statue's had been, but these hands were whole. She did not speak. She simply looked at him, and in her gaze, he felt the full weight of his own grief, a grief she seemed not to condemn but to share. From his bunk across the room, PFC Evans stirred in his sleep, mumbling a single clear phrase, "Smells like flowers." Outside, a soldier on late-night patrol walking along Nash Boulevard paused, looking up at the second-floor windows of the barracks. He saw a soft blue light pulsing in one of the rooms, a light with no source he could identify, and he shook his head before continuing on his rounds. At that same moment, a single clear chime from a church bell rolled across the base, a sound impossible at 3 in the morning, and then there was only silence again. When the light faded and the scent of roses dissipated, Leo found himself on the cold floor beside his bunk, though he had no memory of moving. He was on his knees. A single sob broke from his chest, then another, and then they came in a flood, a deluge of pain and anger and loss held back for a year. He wept for Maria, for their child, for the man he was before the world had broken him. It was not a prayer for forgiveness. It was a surrender. The shaking in his hand was gone. The next morning, he put in for a day pass. He drove his truck not into the city for a drink or a distraction, but directly to St. Patrick's Church. The makeshift shrine of candles and flowers had grown. The police tape was still there, a flimsy barrier. He ducked under it. He found a groundskeeper's shed unlocked and took out a push broom and a dustpan. He started with the smallest fragments of marble, sweeping them carefully into small, white piles. His movements were slow, methodical, a penance in motion. He gathered the larger pieces by hand, his fingers tracing the breaks in the cold stone. The serene curve of the cheek, a piece of the flowing robe, one of the broken hands. He laid each one gently on the stone pedestal, arranging them not as a puzzle to be solved, but as relics to be honored. When he was done, he reached up and unclasped the chain around his neck. He pulled his dog tags from under his t-shirt, the 2 small pieces of metal warm from his skin. He looked at the name stamped into them, Martinez Leo, and then he laid them down among the broken pieces of marble. He had no words, only this small metal offering of his own broken self. The old woman with the little dog, whose name was Agnes, saw him from her front porch across the street. She watched the soldier in uniform working for over an hour, his movements filled with a quiet reverence. She did not call the police. That afternoon, she walked over and placed a thermos of hot coffee on the low stone wall of the grotto, leaving it there for him without a word. When Leo found it, it was still warm, and he drank it, feeling the warmth spread through his chest. Miles away in Watertown's Thompson Park, a teenager named Kyle was scrolling through the local news on his phone. He saw a picture of the smashed statue, and for a reason he couldn't explain, it made his stomach clench. He looked at the empty chip bag and soda bottle at his feet, and without thinking, he picked them up and walked them over to a trash can. It was a small gesture, an unconscious tidying of a world that suddenly felt fragile and in need of care. The parish priest, Father Michael, found the dog tags that evening when he came to pray at the ruined grotto. He picked them up, the metal cool in his palm. He read the name and understood. He did not take them to the police or to the commanding officer at Fort Drum. He slipped them into his pocket, recognizing them as a confession more honest than any he might hear in a booth. He knew this was not an ending, but a beginning. Months passed. The stark New York winter gave way to a tentative spring. At St. Patrick's, a new grotto was built. The parish had commissioned a new statue, but the parishioners had insisted that the pieces of the old one be incorporated. A stonemason had carefully set the fragments into the new back wall, creating a mosaic of the broken marble, a testament to what had been shattered and what had been restored. Embedded in the mortar near the base were two small, weathered dog tags. Leo Martinez was still a soldier. He still wore the uniform, still held his posture with rigid discipline. But something in his eyes had changed. The hardness had softened, replaced by a quiet presence. Most evenings, after his duties at Fort Drum were done, he would drive to the church. He wasn't there to pray, not in the old way. He was there to work. He tended the new rose bushes planted around the grotto, his hands gentle in the soil. He pulled weeds, watered the blossoms, and kept the space immaculate. His service became a quiet fixture of parish life. People grew accustomed to seeing the soldier in his fatigues kneeling in the dirt, tending the flowers. A new parishioner once asked Father Michael about the man in the garden. The priest smiled. "He's just a man who found his way home," he said. "He reminds us that nothing is so broken it can't be made beautiful again." Leo had found his new mission, not in a distant war zone, but in a small garden, in the simple, healing act of making something grow. This story is not about the shattering of a stone statue, but about the mending of a human soul. It reminds us that grace doesn't always arrive in a moment of perfect faith. Sometimes it finds us when we are on our knees in the rubble, when all we have left to offer are the broken pieces of ourselves. It shows us that the most profound encounters with the divine happen not when we are strong, but when we are finally willing to surrender. If this story touched you, like the video, subscribe to, and share it with someone who needs hope today. Tell us your moment of unexpected grace in the comments.